It was a warm spring morning in a small town in Georgia. The air outside carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. Inside Lincoln Middle School, sunlight streamed through the tall classroom windows, painting golden lines across the dusty floor. The sound of chatter, laughter, and the faint squeak of sneakers filled the air. It was just another ordinary school day, or at least it seemed that way. In the middle of all the noise sat Marcus, a quiet 12-year-old boy with deep brown eyes and a calm face. He was one of those students most people hardly noticed, not because he wasn't smart, but because he preferred to stay silent. He didn't talk much unless someone asked him a question directly. He liked sitting at the back near the window where he could look outside at the trees and daydream, while pretending to take notes. Marcus wasn't like most of the kids in his class. He didn't care about showing off new shoes or talking about the latest phone or video game. What he cared about was music, the one thing that made him feel alive. Every day after school, he would hurry home, grab his old violin, and play for hours in his small room. The instrument wasn't new. It had scratches and faded varnish, but to Marcus it was his treasure. It had once belonged to his grandmother, who had taught him his first song before she passed away. Whenever he played, it felt like she was still there with him, smiling proudly. But no one at school knew about that part of Marcus's life. To them, he was just the quiet kid with hand-me-down clothes and a strange habit of carrying a violin case sometimes. The few times he brought it to school, the other students would whisper or giggle. "Who even plays violin anymore?" someone would joke. "That's so old-fashioned," another would add. Marcus would just smile softly and pretend he didn't hear them. He had learned a long time ago that silence was sometimes stronger than words. His teachers knew he was polite and hardworking, but they didn't really see him either. In a classroom full of loud voices, it was easy to miss the quiet ones. Most teachers focused on the students who spoke up, answered questions, or made jokes. Marcus didn't fit into any of those categories. He wasn't a troublemaker, but he also wasn't a star student. He was simply there, quiet, invisible, and peaceful. That morning, the classroom buzzed with excitement because it was Friday. Everyone was in a good mood. The science teacher, Mrs. Jenkins, was trying to start the lesson, but no one was really paying attention. A group of students near the front were laughing about something funny that happened at lunch. Others were doodling or whispering. Marcus sat quietly, sketching little music notes in his notebook while half listening to the noise around him. Mrs. Jenkins, though kind-hearted, sometimes liked to tease her students to make class more fun. She noticed the violin case leaning against Marcus's chair. It was old and worn, and she hadn't seen him bring it before. "Marcus," she called with a playful tone, "what's in that violin case of yours? You hiding something special in there?" The class turned to look at him, their faces filled with curiosity and amusement. Marcus felt his cheeks warm. "It's my violin," he said softly. The students giggled. One boy snickered, "You play violin? For real?" Another added, "What are you, like from a movie or something?" The laughter spread quickly, not cruel but careless, the kind of laughter that still stings. Mrs. Jenkins smiled, not realizing how uncomfortable Marcus felt. "Oh, really?" she said with a chuckle. "Maybe you'll give us a little concert sometime." The class roared with laughter again. Even though it was said as a joke, Marcus could feel every laugh like a tiny needle. He looked down at his notebook, pretending to write something so no one would see his eyes start to water. He didn't hate anyone in that room. He just wished they could see that music wasn't something to laugh about. It was his voice, the way he spoke to the world when words didn't work. But of course no one knew that. They only saw a shy boy with an old violin case and a quiet face. As the lesson went on, Marcus stayed silent. He tried to focus, but his mind wandered to the violin resting beside him. He thought about the songs his grandmother used to play, about how she always said, "Marcus, when you play, don't just play the notes. Tell your story." That memory made him smile a little, even as the teasing whispers continued around him. The classroom that morning felt ordinary. The same chatter, the same laughter, the same walls filled with posters about science experiments and inspirational quotes. But underneath that ordinary day, something extraordinary was waiting to happen. None of the students, not even the teachers, knew that by the end of the day, that quiet boy in the back would change how everyone saw him. The air outside was bright and still. The clock on the wall ticked toward the afternoon. Marcus glanced at his violin case one more time, his fingers tracing the handle. He didn't know it yet, but soon that old violin, the one everyone joked about, would silence an entire classroom. And for the first time, they would truly hear him. The final school bell had just rung for the afternoon break, and the classroom filled with the sound of scraping chairs, giggles, and playful shouts. The students were in high spirits, tossing paper balls, sharing snacks, and joking around. For them, it was just another light moment before the weekend. But for Marcus, sitting quietly in the corner, it was the time he usually spent drawing in his notebook or polishing the strings of his violin. The sun outside shone brighter than usual, casting warm golden light across the desks. The classroom looked alive. Colorful charts on the walls, messy backpacks under chairs, and the faint smell of chalk still in the air. A few teachers were walking past the open door, chatting and laughing, checking in on their students during the free period. Everything seemed perfectly normal, but destiny had something else planned for that day. Marcus had his violin case resting beside his chair again. He had brought it because his music teacher had asked him to stay after school for practice. But before that could happen, one small moment would change everything. A group of students sitting near the front noticed the violin case and began whispering. "He actually brought it again?" one girl said with a smirk. "Maybe he's going to play us a sad song," another boy joked, trying to make his friends laugh. The teasing wasn't cruel at first. It was the kind of careless humor that happens when kids don't realize their words can cut deep. Soon, one of the teachers, Mr. Collins, walked into the room. He was a young teacher, funny and loved by most students. He liked keeping things lighthearted, always trying to make his students smile. He saw the violin case and grinned. "Well, what's this?" he asked playfully. "Marcus, are we getting a concert today?" The class erupted in laughter again. Even a few teachers in the hallway peeked in, curious about what was happening. Marcus froze. His fingers clutched the edge of his desk. He looked up slowly, his eyes unsure but polite. "No, sir," he said softly. "I just brought it for music class later." But Mr. Collins, thinking he was just being shy, decided to keep the mood going. "Come on, don't be modest. Let's hear something," he said, his tone friendly, unaware of the sting it carried. The students cheered and clapped, some shouting, "Yeah, play something, Marcus." Others laughed, pretending to play invisible violins in the air. Marcus felt the back of his neck grow hot. His heart started to beat faster. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and vanish. He looked down at the violin case. It wasn't the first time someone had made fun of him for liking classical music. He was used to whispers and jokes, but something about this moment felt heavier, more public. The laughter around him echoed like thunder in his ears. Still, Marcus didn't get angry. Inside him there was something stronger than embarrassment. It was pride. Pride in what his grandmother had taught him. Pride in every note he had learned through tears and practice. He looked up at the teacher and gave a small, almost invisible smile. "Okay," he whispered. The room went quiet for a second, surprised that he had agreed. A few students exchanged glances. They hadn't expected him to actually do it. Mr. Collins chuckled lightly, still thinking it was all part of a harmless joke. "All right then, let's hear what you've got," he said, gesturing for Marcus to stand at the front of the room. Marcus stood slowly, feeling every eye on him. The room suddenly felt too small, too bright. He picked up the violin case with both hands, his fingers trembling just a little. When he placed it on the teacher's desk and opened the worn brown lid, the laughter began again, softer this time, more curious than cruel. The violin looked old, its wood faded from years of use. A few strings were slightly frayed, and the bow had seen better days. But to Marcus it was beautiful. He lifted the violin gently, holding it as though it were alive. The chatter faded a little. Even the students who had been laughing now leaned forward, wondering what he was going to do. Marcus tucked the violin under his chin, his posture straightening with quiet confidence. "Wait, he's really going to play?" one student whispered. Mr. Collins smiled awkwardly, suddenly realizing this might not be funny after all. "Go ahead, Marcus," he said softly. Marcus took a deep breath. He could feel his grandmother's voice in his mind, calm and steady. "When you play, Marcus, don't just make sound. Tell your story." He closed his eyes for a moment, blocking out the classroom, the whispers, the laughter. The world shrank until it was just him and the violin, His hand moved slowly, drawing the bow across the strings. The first note floated through the air, clear, smooth, and trembling with emotion. The laughter stopped instantly. It wasn't just a note. It was a voice, pure and honest, echoing through the classroom like something holy. Marcus didn't even look up. He was lost in the music, in the world only he could create. Each stroke of the bow carried a piece of his heart, his pain, his hope, his love for the one person who had believed in him. The same students who had mocked him moments ago sat frozen, their smiles fading into awe. The teacher's grin disappeared too, replaced by quiet astonishment. No one said a word. The prank that had started in laughter was slowly turning into something no one could have predicted. Something beautiful, unforgettable, and life-changing. And in that silent classroom, as Marcus played his heart out, everyone began to realize this was no joke. For a few seconds after Mr. Collins asked him to play, Marcus just stood there holding the violin in his hands. The room, which had been filled with laughter moments ago, suddenly felt too still, like time itself was waiting to see what he would do. Every pair of eyes was fixed on him. Some were amused, some curious, and a few even doubtful. Marcus could hear his heartbeat thumping loudly in his chest. His palms were a little sweaty, and the violin felt heavier than usual. He looked down at the floor, pretending to adjust the bow. But inside his mind, 100 thoughts raced all at once. Should I really play? What if I mess up? What if they laugh again? He had been through this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. Growing up, he had faced teasing for things he loved. Reading too much, being quiet, and most of all, playing the violin. It wasn't the cool thing to do. Most kids his age were into sports or games, but Marcus had always found peace in melodies. Still, moments like this always brought back that old sting, the feeling of being different. He could feel his throat tighten. His eyes wandered to the back of the room where the window stood half open. A soft breeze drifted in, carrying the faint sound of birds chirping outside. For a split second, Marcus thought about walking out, just quietly putting the violin away and returning to his seat. No one would care. They'd just laugh it off and move on. It would be easier. But then something inside him whispered, no. It wasn't pride or anger. It was something gentler, stronger. A voice from deep within that reminded him of who he was. He could almost hear his grandmother's voice, warm and patient. Marcus, when people don't understand your silence, let your music speak. Never hide what makes you special. He took a small breath. His fingers stopped shaking. The students were still waiting. Some had grown restless, tapping pencils or whispering to each other again. A few smirked, assuming he'd lost his nerve. Mr. Collins gave a light laugh to break the tension. It's okay, Marcus. You don't have to if you're shy, he said kindly, trying to end the moment. But Marcus slowly looked up. There was something in his eyes, not anger, not pride, just quiet determination. No, sir, he said softly. I'll play. The classroom fell silent again. Even the students who had been giggling earlier now leaned forward, a little curious. They didn't know it yet, but that small moment, that decision to play, would change everything. Marcus placed the violin under his chin and held the bow just above the strings. But before drawing it, he hesitated once more. His gaze drifted to the faces around him. Some were waiting to laugh. Others were watching with mild interest. No one expected much, and maybe that's what gave him strength. The freedom of being underestimated. He thought about his grandmother again. He remembered sitting on her porch on summer evenings, her voice soft as she guided his hands across the strings. He remembered how she smiled when he made mistakes, telling him, "Music isn't about being perfect, Marcus. It's about being honest." That memory filled him with warmth, chasing away the nervousness inch by inch. The violin was more than wood and strings. It was his heart, his memories, his safe place. Every scratch on it told a story of struggle, of love, of dreams. He couldn't let laughter silence that. Not now. He lifted his bow again. The first sound he drew wasn't even a full note, just a whisper of music, soft and shaky, like a voice finding its courage. He paused, took another breath, and began again, this time more firmly. The note echoed through the classroom, delicate and clear. The chatter stopped completely. Marcus closed his eyes, letting himself drift into the rhythm. The hesitation that had once chained him was melting away, replaced by a quiet kind of bravery. Each second that passed made him stronger. He forgot about the classroom, the students, the teachers, even the prank that had started it all. There was only the sound now, the pure, trembling sound of truth. He thought about all the times he'd practiced late into the night while his mother worked double shifts. He remembered how his grandmother's hands had guided his first scales, how she'd told him that music could heal pain if he played it from the heart. That's what he was doing now, pouring everything inside him into the strings. As the melody began to form, something in the air changed. It was as if the walls themselves were listening. The laughter that had filled the room earlier now seemed like a distant memory. Students who had been leaning back lazily were now sitting upright, their eyes following every movement of his bow. Even Mr. Collins, who had started the joke, stood frozen, his smile fading into quiet awe. He could see it now. This wasn't just some shy kid with a hobby. This was someone extraordinary. The longer Marcus played, the more his confidence grew. His hesitation was gone. What replaced it was light, the kind of light that shines only when someone dares to be fully themselves. When the final note faded, there was a moment of pure silence, the kind that hums louder than applause. Marcus lowered his violin slowly, breathing deeply. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. And in that stillness, every person in that classroom, every student, every teacher, understood something they had never realized before. That the boy they thought was quiet wasn't empty. He was full of stories, of music, of magic they'd almost missed. For a moment, the whole classroom was still. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if even the sunlight had stopped moving. Marcus stood at the front of the room, holding his violin like it was the most precious thing in the world. The wooden floor creaked softly under his shoes, but otherwise, silence. Every student was watching, and every heartbeat seemed to echo. He closed his eyes, drew in a slow breath, and let it out carefully. His hands stopped trembling. The bow in his right hand hovered just above the strings, while his left fingers found their place almost by instinct. It was a position he knew by heart, one that felt like home. Then he played the first note. It was soft. So soft that at first, no one was sure if they'd really heard it. But then the sound grew, spreading gently across the room like ripples on water. The note was clear, rich, and full of emotion. Not loud, not flashy, but honest. It carried something that couldn't be faked. Truth. Every ear tuned in. The laughter, the whispers, the playful smirks, all vanished. Even the students who had teased him earlier now sat frozen. The sound of the violin wrapped around them like warm sunlight after a cold day. Marcus didn't open his eyes. He didn't need to. In his mind, he wasn't in that classroom anymore. He was back in his grandmother's living room, the small, cozy space where it had all begun. He could almost smell the faint scent of jasmine tea, hear the old clock ticking softly on the wall, and see his grandmother smiling from her rocking chair, nodding to the rhythm of his playing. The second note came, and then the third. The melody began to take shape, slow, soulful, and hauntingly beautiful. Each note seemed to tell a story of love, struggle, and hope all at once. Marcus wasn't just playing music. He was speaking in a language that didn't need words. One of the teachers, Mrs. Jenkins, who had stopped by the doorway, felt her throat tighten. She had taught hundreds of students over the years, but she had never seen a child play like this. Not with this kind of emotion. It wasn't polished or perfect, but it was real. The bow moved back and forth, steady and sure now, as if guided by something beyond him. Every string vibrated with power, and the notes danced through the air, filling the classroom with a strange kind of magic. The students exchanged silent glances, their faces slowly changing from amusement to awe. Even the class clown, who usually couldn't go a minute without cracking a joke, sat with his mouth slightly open, completely still. Marcus's world had changed in those few minutes. The same violin that had made him a target of jokes was now commanding everyone's full attention. The same shy hands that once hid under the desk were now creating something that no one in that room would ever forget. His fingers moved faster now, and the melody grew stronger. The sound rose and fell like waves, each note bursting with emotion. The bowstring sang, sometimes soft as a whisper, sometimes fierce as thunder. It was a story of pain and beauty woven together, of everything he had ever felt but never said. In his mind, Marcus saw his grandmother again. She was sitting in her chair, smiling, eyes glistening with pride. Her voice echoed in his heart. Marcus, don't just play the notes, play your soul. He was doing exactly that. When the music reached its highest point, something changed in the air. A few students felt goosebumps run up their arms. One girl quietly wiped a tear from her eye. Even Mr. Collins, who had started the whole thing as a harmless joke, stood perfectly still, his smile long gone. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and realized how wrong he had been to laugh. This wasn't a boy trying to impress anyone. This was an artist showing the truth of his heart. The last part of the song came softly, like the wind settling after a storm. Marcus slowed down, letting each final note linger in the air a little longer, as if he didn't want to let go. The sound grew quieter and quieter until the very last note faded into silence. And that silence, it was the loudest thing anyone had ever heard. For a few seconds, no one moved. The students didn't clap. The teachers didn't speak. The only sound was the faint ticking of the classroom clock. It was as if everyone was afraid to break the moment. Marcus slowly lowered his violin. His breathing was steady, calm. He finally opened his eyes, expecting maybe a few smirks or whispers again. But instead, he saw something he'd never seen before in that room. Respect. The students looked at him differently now, their faces soft, their eyes wide. Even Mr. Collins's expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between pride and shame. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't need to. His heart was full. For the first time, he felt truly seen, not as the quiet boy, not as the target of a joke, but as someone who mattered. In that moment, he realized something important. Sometimes life gives you an audience that laughs, but if you dare to play anyway, if you dare to be yourself, those same people might just fall silent and wonder. And in that classroom, surrounded by stunned faces and a silence thick with emotion, Marcus's first note had become something far bigger than music. It had become a message, one that said, "Never underestimate a quiet soul." When the last note faded, the classroom didn't feel like the same place anymore. The walls that once echoed with laughter and teasing now held a deep, powerful silence, the kind that made people hold their breath without even realizing it. Something invisible had shifted. A few students blinked, unsure what had just happened. Their faces showed confusion at first, then wonder, then a quiet sort of guilt. It was as if everyone had woken up from a dream, or maybe from a mistake. The boy they had laughed at just minutes ago had turned their joke into something breathtaking. Marcus stood at the front, still holding the violin close to his chest. His hands were trembling a little, not from fear anymore, but from the emotion that came after giving everything you have. He didn't look proud. He didn't smile. He just looked peaceful, like someone who had finally spoken a truth he had kept locked inside for too long. No one dared to move. Even the teachers who had peeked in from the hallway stayed silent, eyes wide. Mr. Collins, the teacher who had started the prank without meaning harm, looked down at the floor for a moment. He wasn't smiling anymore. Instead, his face softened with something between awe and shame. Finally, one sound broke the silence, the sound of slow clapping. It started from the back of the room. It was soft at first, hesitant, then grew stronger. One by one, students joined in. The clapping turned into applause. Not the playful kind, not the teasing kind, but real applause. Genuine, respectful, filled with emotion. Marcus blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected this. He had imagined laughter, whispers, maybe even more teasing. But applause? That was something he had never felt before. His heart swelled in his chest, and for a moment he didn't know what to do. Mr. Collins finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Marcus," he said, "that was incredible." He paused, searching for the right words. "I don't think any of us expected that. I think we just learned something very important today." The students nodded silently. Some were still staring at Marcus, trying to understand how the same quiet boy who never raised his hand in class had just performed something so powerful. A girl near the front, one of the loudest ones earlier, raised her hand timidly. "Marcus," she said softly, "where did you learn to play like that?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at his violin before answering. "My grandma taught me," he said. His voice was small but steady. "She used to play in an orchestra when she was young. She said music could heal people if it comes from the heart. The room stayed silent for a second longer, letting his words sink in. Some students lowered their heads, thinking about how quickly they had judged him, how easily they had turned his quiet passion into a joke. Something about that moment changed not only how they saw Marcus, it changed how they saw each other. For the rest of the class, no one went back to joking or shouting. The noise that usually filled every break was gone. Instead, there was a strange calmness, a quiet respect that lingered in the air. A few students even went up to Marcus afterward, telling him his music was beautiful. One boy patted him gently on the shoulder and said, "Man, you're seriously talented." Marcus smiled shyly, not sure what to say. He wasn't used to praise, but deep down something in him began to glow, a feeling he hadn't felt before. It wasn't about pride. It was about finally being seen. Even Mr. Collins couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. When the bell rang and the students began to leave, he asked Marcus to stay behind for a moment. Marcus nodded quietly, his violin case still in hand. As the classroom emptied, Mr. Collins leaned against the desk and sighed. "Marcus," he said, "I owe you an apology. I didn't mean to embarrass you. I thought it would be funny, and I didn't realize how talented you are." Marcus shook his head. "It's okay, sir," he said with a small smile. "You didn't know." Mr. Collins nodded slowly, his eyes soft. "No, but now I do. And I want everyone else to know, too." He paused, thinking for a moment. "How would you feel about performing at the school assembly next week?" "I think everyone deserves to hear that." Marcus's eyes widened. He hadn't expected that. "Really?" he asked softly. "Really," Mr. Collins said, "and this time no one will be laughing." For a second, Marcus didn't say anything. Then slowly he smiled, a real bright smile that reached his eyes. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll do it." As he walked home that day, violin case swinging at his side, the world felt different. The same streets, the same trees, the same sky, but lighter somehow, like a heavy weight had finally lifted from his shoulders. He could still hear the echo of applause in his mind. He thought about his grandmother again, how proud she would have been if she had seen him that day. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." And somewhere deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The boy who had once been laughed at was no longer invisible. He had found his voice, not through shouting, not through anger, but through music. That day everything changed, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who heard him play. Because once you witness something that real, that powerful, you can't go back to seeing the world the same way again. When the last echo of Marcus's music faded, the classroom became the quietest it had ever been. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from boredom or discipline. It was different, heavier, filled with emotion. It was the kind of silence that made people realize they had just witnessed something they didn't fully understand. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each click echoing louder than usual. Outside, the sound of the wind brushed against the windows, but inside there was nothing. No laughter, no whispers, no movement. Every student sat frozen in their seat, their minds still replaying the melody that had just filled the room. Marcus stood at the front, eyes still slightly lowered, his violin pressed against his chest as if he was protecting it, or maybe as if it was protecting him. His heart was still racing, but not from fear anymore. It was from something else, a strange mix of relief, pride, and wonder. He had done it. He had finally shown them who he really was. He looked around the room, expecting someone to speak, maybe even tease him again. But no one did. The same students who had laughed earlier were now quiet, their eyes soft and thoughtful. A few of them looked down at their desks, embarrassed by how they had acted. Some blinked quickly, trying to hide the emotion in their eyes. Even Mr. Collins, the teacher who had started it all, seemed lost for words. His face, which usually carried a playful smile, now showed a different kind of expression, one that mixed surprise, guilt, and admiration all at once. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped because there was nothing he could say that would be enough. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was sacred. One student, a boy sitting in the middle row, finally broke it, but not with words. He simply clapped once, softly, almost hesitantly. That single clap echoed in the quiet room. Then another student joined. Then another. And suddenly the room was filled with gentle applause, slow, sincere, and filled with meaning. Marcus looked up, startled. He had expected rejection, not this. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment he didn't know what to do. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not like this. But as the applause continued, something warm spread through his chest. Mr. Collins finally found his voice. "Marcus," he said quietly, almost whispering, "that was beautiful." Marcus didn't answer right away. He didn't know what to say. He just nodded, his lips curving into a shy, humble smile. He wasn't playing for attention. He hadn't done it to prove anyone wrong. He had simply done it because it was who he was. And somehow that honesty had touched everyone in the room. As the clapping faded, the silence returned. But this time, it felt peaceful. The air in the classroom was different now, softer. The students looked at Marcus with new eyes that saw him not as the quiet kid in the corner, but as something far more. Someone brave, talented, and real. The rest of the period passed quietly. No one joked, no one whispered. Even after the bell rang, many students lingered, still caught in the moment. Some went up to Marcus, offering quiet compliments. "That was amazing," one said. "I didn't know you could do that," said another. Their voices were gentle, careful, like they didn't want to break something fragile and beautiful. Marcus nodded and thanked them softly. He wasn't used to praise, and his shy smile never left his face. He felt lighter, freer, like the weight of being misunderstood had finally lifted from his shoulders. Mr. Collins waited until everyone had left before approaching him. "Marcus," he said, his voice low and sincere, "I owe you an apology." Marcus shook his head. "You don't have to, sir," he said, but Mr. Collins smiled sadly. "No, I do. What I thought was just a little joke turned out to be the most powerful lesson I've seen in years." He paused, then added, "You reminded me today why I became a teacher." Marcus didn't know what to say. He just smiled again, a small, quiet smile that said everything words couldn't. As he packed his violin, Mr. Collins said, "You know, there's a talent show next month. I think you should enter. I'll help you prepare if you want." Marcus looked up, his eyes bright with surprise. "Really?" "Really," Mr. Collins said with a nod. "The world needs to hear that music, Marcus." When Marcus left the classroom, the hallway outside buzzed with noise again. Students laughing, lockers slamming, the usual chaos of school life. But to him it all sounded different. Softer. Kinder. As he walked home that day, violin case in hand, he replayed the moment in his mind. The laughter, the silence, the applause, all of it felt unreal, like a dream he didn't want to wake up from. For the first time, he wasn't invisible anymore. The silence that had once followed him, the one filled with loneliness and misunderstanding, had turned into something beautiful. It had become a silence filled with respect, warmth, and awe. That day, Marcus learned something powerful. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words, and music can heal even the wounds that laughter leaves behind. And though he didn't know it yet, that single performance, born from a prank, would ripple far beyond that classroom. It would become a story people remembered, a reminder to never judge, never mock, and never underestimate the quiet ones. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truth. After that unforgettable day, Marcus's story began to spread quietly through the school. It wasn't through social media or announcements. It spread the old-fashioned way, through whispers, retellings, and wide-eyed disbelief. Students who hadn't even been in the classroom came up to Marcus in the hallways, curious and respectful. "Hey, you're the violin guy, right?" They'd say, not with mockery this time, but with admiration. Marcus would blush, smile politely, and nod. He didn't like attention, but he couldn't deny how different things felt now. The same hallways that once felt like places to hide now felt open and bright. For the first time, people saw him not as the quiet kid, but as someone with a story. Even Mr. Collins had changed. His voice was softer when he spoke to Marcus. He often asked how practice was going or if Marcus would play again for the class. Other teachers stopped Marcus in the hall, asking if they could hear him perform sometime. But none of them knew the full truth, the story behind the music that had left them speechless. It happened one afternoon a few days later. Marcus was sitting alone in the music room, his favorite place in the whole school. The walls were covered in posters of famous composers, and the air always smelled faintly of wood polish and old sheet music. He had just finished tuning his violin when Mr. Collins walked in. "There you are," Mr. Collins said with a smile. "I thought I'd find you here. You've become a bit of a legend, you know?" Marcus chuckled softly. "I didn't mean to." "I know," the teacher said kindly, pulling up a chair. "That's what makes it special." He hesitated, looking at the violin. "Can I ask you something, Marcus? Where did you learn to play like that? You said your grandma taught you?" Marcus nodded. His eyes softened at the mention of her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She started teaching me when I was 5. She used to play in an orchestra when she was young, but after my grandpa passed away, she stopped. She said music hurt too much." Mr. Collins leaned forward, listening closely. "One day," Marcus continued, "I found her old violin in a box in the attic. It was dusty and missing a string, but when I touched it, I don't know, it felt alive, like it was waiting." He smiled faintly. "When she found me trying to play, she didn't get mad. She just cried. Then she picked up the bow for the first time in years and said, 'If you're going to play, you'll do it right.' And that's how it started." Mr. Collins's eyes glistened. "She must have been proud of you." Marcus looked down, tracing his finger along the edge of the violin. "She was," he said softly. "But she got sick a few years ago. Before she passed away, she told me, 'Marcus, don't stop playing, not even when people laugh. One day they'll understand.'" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Mr. Collins felt a lump in his throat. The story behind the music made everything he had witnessed that day even more powerful. He realized then that the prank, that careless, thoughtless moment, had been a blessing in disguise. Without it, none of them would have discovered who Marcus really was. "You know something, Marcus?" he said finally. "That violin of yours? It's not just an instrument. It's a bridge. You're carrying your grandmother's spirit every time you play." Marcus smiled shyly, looking down at the strings. "That's what I feel too," he admitted. "When I play, it's like she's still here, guiding my hands." After that day, Marcus's relationship with his teachers and classmates began to grow in unexpected ways. People started inviting him to play at small school events, not out of pity, but out of respect. They wanted to feel that magic again, that same emotional rush his music created. At first, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't used to being in front of crowds, but every time he thought about saying no, he'd remember his grandmother's words, "Don't stop playing, not even when people laugh." And so he said yes. His next performance was at the school assembly. The auditorium was packed, students, teachers, even parents. Many of them had heard rumors about the boy who silenced a classroom. When Marcus walked onto the stage with his violin, the crowd grew quiet instantly. He could feel his heart beating fast, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He stood there, took a deep breath, and began to play. The sound filled the room like sunlight spilling through stained glass, warm, golden, and alive. By the time he finished, the entire auditorium stood and clapped. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others just stood there, stunned, unable to believe how a boy so quiet could produce something so powerful. That was the day everyone truly understood who Marcus was. Not just a boy, but a reminder that talent, heart, and courage don't always wear loud voices or confident smiles. Sometimes they hide behind quiet eyes and calloused fingers holding an old violin. Later that evening, as Marcus packed up his instrument, Mr. Collins approached him with a gentle smile. "You know," he said, "your grandmother was right. One day they'd understand. That day is today." Marcus looked up at him, his eyes shining. "Yes," he said softly. "I think she'd be proud." And for the first time, he believed it too.